Lunch, Lady Doris. Have you got any grease?
Yes, we do.
Then grease me up, woman!
Hey folks, this is Grease Scotsman. Welcome to the Boneworks Mapping Guide, Part 2, Scene Zones, otherwise lovingly known as the SLZ method of spawning stuff. Yesterday, Maranara released an update to the custom map template. A lot has gone into this update, and Maranara will be releasing a features overview of the update shortly, which will cover all of the new additions like prefabs for destructible ammo boxes, Trev's ladder prefab, and several others. I'll link that features overview video in the description once it's available. This update also officially includes the custom map Unity tools, which are the set of custom Unity inspectors, editor scripts, and gizmos that I've written to attempt to make the mapping process more accessible. Perhaps the most important features included in this update are scene zones and scriptable objects, which together allow mappers to spawn items and NPCs using the native scripts SLZ themselves used when building Boneworks. There is no longer a need for additional mods or coding to spawn items placed in your map in Unity. The custom map Unity tools have been refactored entirely to accommodate these changes, with the goal of automating the process of placing and linking items within each zone. Having manually gone through updating the old template, relinking scripts, and resolving other issues when I first started figuring out how scene zones worked a few weeks ago, I want to thank Maranara for his time spent integrating and organizing everything so that it works seamlessly. Scene zones are large trigger volumes in Unity with specific layers and tags that track what items and NPCs are spawned and active in a given section of the map. A zone becomes active when the player enters it, or if the zone is linked to a zone that the player currently occupies. While a player is in a zone, all the zone items marked with the primary trigger option become active. All zones linked to the player's current primary zone will activate any zone items listed with the secondary trigger option. I'll go through an in-depth example explaining primary and secondary trigger options shortly, but know that these systems are extremely powerful once you tinker with them enough to gain a solid understanding of their functionality. Let's cover the basics and navigate to the Custom Map Unity Tools Prefabs Scene Zones folder in the Custom Map template and drag the Custom Map Scene Zone into the scene. This prefab contains a box collider that denotes the size and shape of the scene zone, the Unity Tools Scene Zone utility script that will help automate managing the various zone items that we'll add to the zone, and the SLZ Scene Zone script itself that references the box collider, the list of linked zones and zone items, and a number of Unity events that allow you to trigger actions upon any game object when the player enters or exits the zone. In most cases, we'll be using scene zones to spawn items and NPCs. You can also use them to play sounds or music. Keep in mind that items, once spawned, will stick around forever, regardless of whether the player has left the scene zone. In addition to the Unity tools, and one of the benefits of using scene zones is that we now have the ability to spawn gun magazines and several other props that aren't normally spawnable with the utility gun. To add the magazine for the Editor 22, simply drag the custom map zone spawner item prefab into the scene and make it a child of the scene zone in which you want it to spawn. Configure its settings using the Unity Tools menu in the inspector. Clicking the Connect Zone Spawner to Scene Zone button will automatically fill out the zone field in the zone spawner script and will add this zone spawner to the scene zone's zone item list in a single action. By default, zone items are set with a primary trigger option and are set to spawn a single item rather than act as an emitter that will spew out multiples of an item. As such, its max, concurrent alive, and concurrent total values are all set to 1. Finally, the auto start and is spawning allowed values are enabled. You can also set the velocity and rotation of whatever gets spawned using the spawn velocity and spawn angular velocity when the zone spawner becomes active. For example, crablets popping out of a pipe would probably look best if given a y-axis boost to appear to be leaping out of the pipe, rather than simply blipping into existence at the mouth of the pipe when the player enters the zone. Spawn clip is used to play a sound when an item or enemy is spawned. While zone spawners can be used to add weapons and items to the map, most of the options are meant to control NPCs, their spawn rates, and their initial behaviors upon spawning. Unlike items which will stay active and enabled once it's spawned into the map no matter what, NPCs will only remain active if the player is in the current zone that contains the zone spawner, if they walk into a scene zone that is linked with that zone, or if the player enters an area with no scene zone at all. In other words, as soon as the player leaves all scene zones that contain or are linked to an NPC's zone spawner, the NPC will deactivate and disappear. This can be jarring to the player if used incorrectly, but when configured as intended, it provides massive performance gains. Before going further, I want to point out that the ZoneAISettings script makes use of the base enemy config scriptable objects. These objects contain the blueprint for all of the NPC's settings, like its FOV cone and view range, its default mental state and behavior, initial health values, whether an NPC like a null body is capable of using the zombie's blue bolt throw attack, the color of the crablet's eye when out of combat or when aggroed, and so on. A series of base configs have been provided that fairly closely match the default NPC settings found in the vanilla game. However, by simply duplicating these scriptable objects, renaming them, and customizing them to your liking, you're able to drastically change how NPCs behave. For example, the Omni projector that acted more like he was wielding a minigun in the Melon Vault sneak peek was really just an Omni projector with a crazy clip size, burst size, and reduced reload time and gun cooldown. When a zone spawner is set to single, one and only one item will spawn from it. Changing the mode to Emitter brings the max, concurrent alive, concurrent total, and spawn frequency values into play. Here's a short demonstration of how these settings work. Max acts like a counter that simply tracks the number of items or NPCs spawned from the zone spawner. Once that number of items reaches max, the zone spawner will no longer fire. I'm going to skip over concurrent alive briefly because it's useful to understand concurrent total first. Concurrent total tracks both alive and dead NPCs that have been spawned from a zone spawner. In the example I've set here, an emitter with a concurrent total of 8 means that if there is any mixture of 8 alive and dead null bodies that have been spawned from this zone spawner, nothing else will spawn from it. So, since our concurrent alive is set to 1, the spawner will keep spawning enemies one by one until there are 8 corpses. However, since the max is 10, there are still 2 possible null bodies to be spawned from this zone spawner. In order to do that, we'll need to enter an unlinked zone and then return to this one, or use something like a trigger from CustomMapInteractions in order to clear the dead null bodies from the scene. Concurrent alive tracks how many NPCs have been spawned from a particular zone spawner that are still alive. A concurrent alive value of 1 simply means that the spawner will spawn a single new null body and won't spawn anything else until that null body dies. When that null body dies, and if the max value and total concurrent values have not been reached, another single null body will spawn. To better illustrate this, we'll rerun this experiment, but with a concurrent alive value of 4. We'll also add a linked zone behind this one, and an unlinked zone next to it, in order to demonstrate that walking into a linked zone does not alter the currently active NPCs or the max value of the spawners in linked zones. Since our concurrent total is 8, that means that we'll amass 8 corpses and then the zone spawner will stop spawning the remaining null bodies. However, stepping into the not linked zone next to zone test will deactivate its NPCs, essentially freeing up the corpses and making room for the final 2 null bodies to spawn once we re-enter the zone. We'll then hit the max value, which effectively disables the zone spawner. To signify that I've entered these zones, I've added another single spawned null body to the linked zone and a katana to the unlinked zone so that we'll know when the player has activated each one. First, we'll hop into the linked zone to show that it has no impact on the corpses or any of our zone spawners' values. However, stepping into an unlinked zone will clear the corpses, and the remaining 2 nulls will spawn when the player returns to the zone. Recall that I set the red spotlight to change its intensity upon spawn of a null body, as a simple demonstration that Unity game objects can have some of their properties changed whenever a scene zone is entered, exited, whenever the zone spawner spawns enemies, and so on. However, there are some severe limitations to consider. First, recall that custom maps are simply geometry, scripts, triggers, items, and enemies that all get spawned on top of an underlying vanilla map, like Blankbox, and the player just gets teleported from Blankbox to the custom spawn point when the custom map loads. This means that we may not have access to any of the functions of a zone spawner that occur before the custom map is loaded, and there is no way without mods to insert code or custom events and actions. So the list of things that we can call or do, even though the scene zones provide for a rich set of triggers and events, is limited to things like adjusting lights and enabling and disabling game objects. The things that would really provide customization and power, like being able to call custom functions, aren't available or accessible through these scene zone and zone spawner event managers that we see in Unity. This is the reason why I've spent so much time creating the CustomMapInteractions mod, and then tried to craft its tools to be fairly generic. The point I'm making with this digression is to shape expectations about what you'll be able to do with the various on-zone disabled and enabled or on-spawn and other events. Now that we have a basic understanding of the zone spawner's options, let's zoom out to the macro level and discuss scene zones, zone placement, linking, and interactivity. The simplest strategy I can offer for mappers when figuring out how scene zones work and how to link them is to consider the player's line of sight. If a player has line of sight to any portion of another zone, those zones should probably be linked together. Here's why. In this example, I've set the first zone with the red light in it. It's still linked to the zone behind it. The zone to the side remains unlinked to any zone. I'm now going to purposefully spawn and aggro the null body from the link zone, and then walk into the zone with the red light to show that the null continues to persist and attack me. However, if I step into the unlinked zone, the null suddenly disappears. This happening by mistake would be very jarring, would tank any flow of decent combat, and would probably annoy the hell out of the player pretty quickly. Let's now look at a slightly more complex example that ignores the line of sight suggestion on purpose, because I want you to be able to see exactly what's happening without any walls or obstacles in the way. There are 5 scene zones in this small test area. The first is this small section along the edge of the wall that will spawn an Editor 22 and a few debugging tools that you may find useful as map makers. I should note that these tools have been added to the menu named Other when you place a Custom Map Item Spawner prefab found in the Custom Map Unity Tools folder into your scene. The small zone is not linked to anything, so I'm going to use it to reset the other zones, and I'll also give myself a weapon in case I need it. The other 4 zones are denoted by the colored squares shown on the floor, and they will be our focus. Selecting Zone Red, you'll see that it is not linked to any other zones, and it has 2 null body zone spawners. One null is within the bounds of Zone Red, and then the other null body is way in the back, outside of all of these scene zones. Both nulls are set to trigger option primary and are single mode spawns. The expected behavior, given what we've learned, is that both nulls will only spawn when the player enters Zone Red. The player can leave Zone Red without consequence, but if they enter any other zone that isn't linked to this one, the null body sitting on the red square will be deactivated. However, because the other null body in the back is outside all other scene zones, he will persist until he touches an unlinked scene zone. Recall that in our prior deactivation and cleanup example, where I was stepping between linked and unlinked zones, the nulls disappeared when I touched the unlinked zone. In short, the game is designed to clean up any NPCs that have strayed into unlinked zones. To ensure combat flows properly, then, hopefully I've highlighted the importance of linking all zones that are within line of sight of each other so that NPCs aren't cleaned up by mistake, and zones that cover a combat encounter should also be linked to avoid NPCs abruptly disappearing if you've aggroed them. Now we'll finally address the secondary trigger option, and this is where the true power of the scene zone system becomes apparent. Similar to Zone Red, the blue zone has a single null body with a trigger option of primary. However, Zone Blue is linked to Zone Green, and Zone Green has a null body zone spawner with a secondary trigger option. Zone Blue is linked to Zone Green, and Green is linked to Blue. This means that the green null will only spawn whenever the player enters a zone that is linked to green, which in this case is Zone Blue. To be really clear, that means that if the player goes directly to Zone Green without first passing through any other zones that are linked to green, the null in the green zone will not spawn. That's because its trigger option is secondary. Let's break this down further to avoid any confusion. Whenever the player enters a zone, that currently occupied zone receives a signal that triggers any zone item spawner with the primary trigger option. Any zones linked with that currently occupied zone receive a secondary trigger signal, activating anything with the secondary trigger option. As the player moves between zones, the new currently occupied zone fires off primary triggers, and any zones linked to it fire secondary signals to any zone items they contain. There's also a hidden option to fire both primary and secondary at the same time. Unfortunately, Unity treats this field in the Zone Spawner and ZoneAISettings scripts as a single select menu rather than a menu where you can multi-select options. To fix this, double-click on the Zone Spawner script to open it into whatever program Unity associates as your code editor. Any text editor, even Notepad, will do though. In Visual Studio, you can right-click on the ZoneItem class and choose Go to Definition to quickly open the ZoneItem.cs file. Alternatively, you can manually open the ZoneItem.cs, which is found in the same directory as the ZoneSpawner.cs script. I'll leave some additional notes in the description in case you need to find this manually within your CustomMapTemplate Unity project. With the ZoneItem.cs file open, simply add both equals 6 and then a comma to the trigger options enum, like so. Instead of creating a whole custom inspector that would allow for multi-selection of primary and secondary together, it's much easier to simply add this both value directly, since all the multi-select would do is add the values of primary and secondary together anyway. 4 plus 2 equals 6. Easy fix, less code. The result? The Zone Spawner and the ZoneAISettings are now able to respond to either primary or secondary signals when the player enters the scene zone. Here's a quick demo of this both trigger option in action. Zones white and black are linked to each other. This means that entering one zone will fire the secondary trigger zone items of the other. First, we're going to enter zone white, which has a null body with a secondary trigger option. In other words, the null in white won't spawn when the player goes directly to it. However, the linked zone black has a null with the both trigger option, so it does spawn successfully. Now we'll reload the map and head directly for zone black. Because zone white is linked with black, we do expect the null body in white, which has a secondary trigger option, to spawn. However, the null in zone black should also spawn because of the both trigger option, where it responds to both primary and secondary triggers. So what does all this look like in an actual map? Well, here's the portion of Melon Vault that's already been disclosed in the previous sneak peek video. You can see that for every room or section of the map, and anywhere line of sight is possible, scene zones abound. I also have a few zones linked to earlier ones even though they never pose a line of sight concern, because I want the potential sound that might occur when, say, spawning a dozen wooden crates for the button of convenience interaction to not be heard by the player. Hopefully this gives you a general idea of scene zones and how they operate in a real-world example. The final topic I want to cover for scene zones is how to bring everything together into a zone encounter. Zone encounters make up some of the best moments of Boneworks. Anytime NPCs are attacking each other or there's large-scale all-out combat between NPCs, a zone encounter is involved. This encounter example will engage 6 zone spawners, 3 for each side, with each set to emit multiple enemies that will act as reinforcements. These enemies will be given a home waypoint to investigate that will ensure that they enter the fray rather than wandering off aimlessly. A zone spawner with the MK18 hollow sight rifle and a pair of medium ammo boxes will provide the loadout for the player. Finally, my favorite soundtrack will kick in the moment that the encounter begins. So if you're sick of Zombo mode, too bad. Unfortunately, it does look like the on-completion event of the zone encounter script doesn't seem to fire, or at least I don't yet know the conditions required to make it fire. So my efforts to turn on a bright light or fire off a particle effect at the end were in vain. However, the encounter itself works, the NPCs are properly hostile to each other, and the zone spawner emitters work as expected. Weeks after figuring out how a good chunk of this stuff works, I'm still learning new things about scene zones. Tinker, experiment, and let me know if you discover anything not covered here. I hope the Boneworks mapping community is able to come up with some amazing interactions with these tools, and they help to improve the scale and depth of the NPC encounters, thanks to the performance improvements provided by the native scene zone implementation. As always, dear viewer, thanks for tuning in.